Thank you, Chris. Thank you. There is a famous performance which just slipped into my mind by Peter Weibel, who will give a seminar in Malta in October. This piece is a performance piece from 1967. Peter is sitting with a cassette recorder on the streets of Vienna, and he plays what can be called the digital code in 1967, long before a kind of a theory of the digitality or so existed. The performance went like that. He had a cassette recorder in front of him, and he said, before he started the machine, I will talk now on the relation of language and machine. He was at that time very strongly a Lacanian thinker, and you will witness two modes, on and off, and he pressed the button and said on, and the recorder reset off, and then he said, I will carry on like that until either the machine breaks down or I break down. This performances went for sometimes many hours, and usually the machine broke down before he broke down. I make this introduction because Catherine and I, and of course the other colleagues before, we are now at the end of these 3 days, at the end of a speaking marathon, roughly 12 hours. So you will see what the machine can still do tonight. And I hope that I still have enough energy and passion for what I want to talk about tonight. The framework of this topic I want to address tonight is manifold. It's part of several larger projects. One project I'm working on since many years. I hope one day I will be able to bring it into a form of a book. The title of this project is Swinging In and Swinging Out. And this is a reflection on the archaic motive of staircases and ladders, and the structures going with this archaic motive. At the end of my lecture tonight, I will a little bit come back to that. The second motive I want to stress out at the beginning is that I try to find my way to think this very hype subjects at the moment, which I circumscribe as artificial extelligence. The way I'm thinking media and the way I'm thinking the interrelations of art, sciences and technology, this is the description of the field when you are a media thinker, is, as many of you know, a deep time approach. And this is the way I also try to address this strange field of artificial intelligence. Last year, I made a presentation in the evening lecture on Ramon Lull, the late medieval thinker of thinking machines, the Catalan who grew up and lived in Mallorca. We made a large exhibition around this thinker, and finally I'm very happy the book is finished. Dialogos, Ramon Lull's Method of Thought and Artistic Praxis, distributed by Minnesota University Press. I give it around. Some of my students have seen it already. I'm very happy that this book exists. This was one approach to discuss the deep time of our current affairs. A medieval thinker with this extreme generous idea that with the help of machines, of paper computers, so to speak, you can perhaps communicate between the Muslim, the Jewish, and the Christian world, because they are all three based on books in their religious thoughts, on one book each, the Talmud, the Quran, and the Bible, and they are all based, of course, on monotheistic religions. This was the starting point for Lul. If this is the case, then it should be possible that you can find forms of formalized communication between them, which might help to rationalize the discourse of religion. Tonight it's something completely different. The title of my presentation is Expanded Materiology, and the subtitle, which I changed within the last 20 minutes, is now Untimely Meditations on what Alchemy has to teach us about the gradual transformation of the real into reality. Mechanization takes command. This was the spectacular title of a legendary book published by Siegfried Gideon in 1948. In this book, with a sweeping gesture, the Swiss scholar of architecture and culture paid tribute to the myriad ways in which mechanics has changed civilization, inscribing itself therein like, he did not use this term, like a dispositif. The ambitious book was designed retrospectively like a monument to the bygone, the classical machine, 1948. For after the Second World War, the hegemony of the mechanical had come to an end. A paradigm shift for the future had already begun to announce itself in the form of electronics, automation, and machines capable of learning. It's the time when Turing developed his concept of the learning machine. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, in their critique of civilization, celebrated the advent of becoming as the new mode of existence a little bit later. As of the late 1970s, Japanese artist Yoichiro Kawaguchi, a very interesting artist, began running his algorithms on platforms that would, over the course of many years, go on endlessly to produce changing artificial bioinformatic worlds. He started this project around 1978, 1979. No more than a half a century after Gideon's great publishing success, cultural techniques of networking and processing had definitely come to permeate everyday life. What we are experiencing at the start of the new century, the history of which is only now being set in motion as a new quality, is above all an acceleration and compression of processes already underway throughout the past several decades. In the following untimely meditation, I am rehearsing and working out the profound contemporaneity of several phenomena associated with this. It takes some time until informatics understands philosophical thoughts. From building to growing. This is how Hiroshi Ishii at the MIT lab designates the paradigm shift that is taking place at present in the design, of sensually experienceable worlds, from building to growing. The fluid, subterranean domains of data streams, which are generated on the dry mechanical platforms of digital machines, are being put in contact with the liquefied materials of all that exists on the surface of and beneath the earth. From this, a new hybrid reality emerges, woven of the finest heterogeneous biological, chemical, and technological components. Synthetic biology is projecting the logic and materiality of the technical age into the living, which is thereby necessarily altered, as are likewise the intelligent data connections. The real gets realized. Xenobiology goes even one step further by trying to develop something like alternative life models in the laboratory. This side of the metaphor, by way of the abstraction, applied information and knowledge in the world of data, a new concretization emerges by means of the abstraction, of applied information and knowledge into the world of data. The consequences of this concretization we still don't know in detail, though precisely herein is where we must school ourselves, as the Czech cultural philosopher Wilhelm Flusser put it. A man, as we know already, who hailed from a Central European central, Prague, which still preserves at least the memory of a narrow lane wherein its alchemists once lived, the Alchemistengasse in Prague. Some of you might know that. The dichotomies opened up by the Japanese bioinformation scientist and designer, Ishii, yield themselves admirably to debate. Essential parts of the new hybrid realities are still digitally, which at core means mechanically produced. Nevertheless, when one reflects on the essential components of the propagated paradigm shift, we have the built, the mechanical constructive on the one hand, and the growing, the becoming, the fluid, the wet or even bloody, and their potential for manipulation on the other hand. We find not only that we are situated in an advanced phase of development of the trance classical machine. This is a term by Max Bense, which we discussed in our seminar, trance classical machine. He coined that around 1948. But also that we are at the same time located inside of a microcosm that has at hand in its development a deep time of several thousand years. Great leaps into the future tend, as a rule, to take the prudent and productive detour through the past. The events and the protagonists of the paradigm shift walk a fine line between investigation of the physical and the metaphysical, between the precise algorithmical command and an indistinct magic between res extensa and res cogitans, as René Descartes conceived of this discrepancy. They also walk the fine line, this is one of my hypotheses, between serious scientific experimentation and charlatanry. And they are very successful with the latter because many, even of us, don't understand what they are doing. Chinese civilization, for example, had no need for dramatic paradigm shifts like those that led to the development of European modernity. With the I Ching, as well as the processual theory of the 5 elements, it has at hand a compact history of ideas and a universal hermeneutic which understand and describe the world in a state of constant flux. It even incorporated very early the idea of binary code as an analytical instrument, as Leibniz observed as early as the 17th century. European modernity, meanwhile, has taught us to hold strictly separate the heterogeneous realities of the material on the one hand and the intellectual or spiritual on the other, even though a number of its most prominent exponents themselves happily dabbled in magicians' treatises and the laboratories of sorcerers' apprentices, quacks, and early gene manipulators. Let us not make the same mistake, so I formulate a little bit dramatically. Let us not make the same mistake of separating that which can only be thought together. Let us meet the new realities, hybrid between calculable control systems and the nervous, sensitive matter of the real, with a new expanded hermeneutic, which I am calling expanded materiologies. From my perspective, this is at present an adequate method by means of which we may be capable of meeting the challenges presented to us by artificial extelligences. The most advanced variants of these already function as hermaphrodites of digital and analog electronic components, like for instance the Neuromorphic Computer brain scale S, which is at the moment the highest level in this field, which Karl-Heinz Meyer developed with his research team at the Kirchhoff Institute for Physics at the University of Heidelberg. It's a computer which works only for the simple solution problems with digitality, with digital strategies, and everywhere where it gets complex and complicated with electronic, analog electronic material. It has a completely different architecture than conventional computers, and you can see in this sketch, for example, of the research team of this university in Heidelberg, that there is a close proximity in thinking the brain and dealing with electronics. By the way, I visited this group 2 years ago, and this time, just to give you an example in what kind of elitist and minority field we are working. This professor had 750 PhD candidates, 750 in his whole team, who are all working on this project of the brain scale computer. So, I mean, we have no chance, but of course we take it permanently. We have no other choice. Let us accept the challenge, this is my plaidoyer, and interpret present trends in art and design as particular actualizations of archaic experiments in the fabrication of experiences midway between the particle and waveforms of the physical world. When I refer to physics here, I am referring on the one hand to the quantum mechanical character of a hyperphysics, and on the other to the natural scientific understanding of somebody like Johann Wilhelm Ritter. We discussed him extensively in my seminar, for whom there could be no such thing as dead matter. As a chemophysicist and early theoretician of electricity, he accepted around 1800. He was contemporary to Novalis. Only the variable vibrational states of maximally animate material conditions. He understood himself fundamentally as a life scientist 200 years before. 2,500 years ago, the coterie of natural philosophers who thought in a similar vein were referred to as atomists. They conceived of the mind as matter pulverized into the tiniest particles. Alchimia meant in ancient Greece the work done with castable materials. In technological terms, metallurgy. The Europeans borrowed processes for manufacturing clean, lustrous gold from high Egyptian civilization, which had been practicing these for more than 1,000 years before our time. At root, Alchimia was concerned with conferring upon raw, yet by all means valuable materials, a still more noble form by means conveying them through an intermediate state induced by the application of intense heat. After this passage through liquefaction, they would again harden into the fixed form of, for instance, silver or gold. Metallurgy was then complemented by dye techniques. Alchimia also taught and practiced the possibilities of submerging material surfaces like woven fabrics in different colors and thus providing them with an attractive semblance. Pharmaceuticals also served semblance as it was concerned with the manufacture of medical means and cosmetics. In other words, with media that serve to heal and to beautify human bodies by means of extracts from plant bodies. Like tattooing, this is another project of mine at the moment. I discuss tattooing and makeup and comparable strategies as contemporary interface strategies. Like tattooing, these were also early forms of interface techniques, thus technifying the ways in which faces and facades were encountered. Facade, interface, this is all the whole, the same etymological field. Particular alchemical ideas and praxis hark far back into the deep time of high Egyptian, Chinese, Byzantine, Indian, and Persian civilization. During one of the most robust periods of ancient China, from the 3rd to the 6th century, the experimental culture of alchemy was known as the way of the golden elixir, Jindanji Dao, in the tradition known as the Great Clarity. The interrelationship between nature and natural things stood in the foreground of this concept of alchemy. Natural philosophical practice was tightly bound with the idea of the path or the way as formulated in religious Taoism. A prominent protagonist of the early Chinese Middle Ages was Ge Hong in the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century after Christ. He was working approximately in parallel with the early masters of Occidental alchemy. In Europe, this was the time during which hegemonic Christianity was waging its merciless battle against everything non-Christian. The arcane and subversive language of the alchemical treatises, like those of Zosimos, I will come back to him, of Panapolis, has its brutal roots in the historical violence of this context Alchemy was the art of the fallen angels, of the multiplied Gabriels, who strove to be equal to or better than God, to surpass him in the begetting of beautiful assemblances. The powerful movements in the first century after Christ were taken up again and reformulated in the 8th and 9th centuries in the Arabic Islamic academic culture. Alchimia. This is the way the Arabs were addressing this experimental praxis and this form of thinking. Alchimia is how they referred to at the House of Wisdom, one of the very early university-like constructions in early 9th century Baghdad, to the correlated experiments and idiosyncratic treatises that proliferated in the textual culture or were translated from other languages. In the European Middle Ages, certain conventions of the Hermetic tradition of natural philosophy made their way to Spain and established themselves there as a program of Alchimia. In its renewed heyday in Christian-inflected Europe, alchemy was in turn deeply influenced by the pertinent theisms. Like with religious Taoism in China, processes of chemical change were analogized with the publication process that chastened and reformed the doubting and disbelieving. The alchemical knowledge and experimental procedures of the adepts were progressively diversified and adapted to every imaginable sphere of life, such as medicine, agriculture, viticulture, and various handicrafts. One consequence of this was the popularization of alchemical treatises and communiques as recipes and instructions for all sorts of transformations of inferior into noble substance, for generating enhanced experiences of reality or a hyper-reality that a few centuries later we would be referring to as augmented reality, a silly term, of course. In 1609, the first chair of chymiatry is established at the University of Marburg with Johannes Hartmann. Alchemy, 69. Alchemy is rationalized and at the same time popularized. As this obscure avant-garde of world metamorphoses emerged to broader public attention, alchemy became a general framework for thought among the applied sciences, technology, art, and magic. It evolved to become an attempt to understand nature in and of itself and in its complex relationship to mind or spirit, to grasp nature in language and in sound, and above all, to visualize it. The coupling of world complexity and Beziehungswahn, a term I cannot translate very well, madness of correlations, becomes the hallmark of a protracted epoch whose medial fulfillment we are presently in the midst of. The nexus, the chain linking everything together, is meanwhile no longer an imaginary one. It has become a technological reality and is processed as the all-pervasive telematic dispositif of the correlative or correlated that we have, meanwhile learned to refer to as the internet. The immense diversity of things that do not and cannot exist, but that may be thought and believed. This had been brought to an incredible fruition, perhaps even culmination, through the wild and wondrous world of the power, the faculty of imagination and natural experiment. Before modern civilization commenced its inexorable work of rationalization, of standardization, and universalization. The historico-cultural function of alchemy might be thus characterized or accentuated. What we see here is from Robert Flood's History of Microcosm and Macrocosm. This is about this Beziehungswahn, the madness of correlation, but it contains also the main thoughts in the alchemistic world. I will come back to some of these single elements during my presentation. Nature turned in on itself, transforms. This is how the fundamental principle of alchemy has often been described. Nature turned in on itself, transforms. In the snake or the dragon that bites its own tail, embodied in ancient Egypt in the figure of Ouroboros, is expressed the principle of the unity, of the union of the individual with the cosmos, with the universe. In an ancient treatise that has survived only in fragmentary form, titled Physica Kai Mystica. This is from Florian Ebeling, a very early work, whose author, Physica Kai Mystica, whose author is given as pseudo-Demokritos. The principle gets declined as follows. I quote from this Physica Kai Mystica in my translation into English from the Latin. I hope it's correct. At the end of the alchemical, first the quote, nature delights in nature, nature dominates nature, once again, nature delights in nature, nature dominates nature, nature defeats nature. At the end of the alchemical process stand the overcoming of nature, only after it has first been radically traversed. This is the sense of this figure and its also symbolic content. In contemporary design, which experiments with data, algorithms, cells, molecules, and atoms, the process is reversed. Natural materials are analyzed first and then informed. Data or algorithms are projected into res extensa, which then in turn are made sensitive to external as well as internal control. The body quasi-excrecates itself through the porous skin that surrounds it to enter into the world. There emerges an ideal interface, as the Austrian artist and writer Oswald Wiener described in the 1960s in an appendix to his experimental novel Die Verbesserung von Mitteleuropa, the improvement of Central Europe. I'm very happy to announce that we managed finally to get this untranslatable text translated against the will of Oswald Wiener, but finally, of course, he agreed under the condition that we have the German text on the side of it, of the English text, so everybody can compare it. It just appeared in Katmos, a publisher in West Berlin in English language. The appendix is called The Bioadapter, 1964-1965. The technological luck suit, quote by Wiener, the technological luck suit, the bioadapter, has a dual trajectory of action, which corresponds with the bias of any given communication or any given medium. It makes the world beyond the artificially generated boundary that imprisons the individuals in Plato's cave into something pleasurable, into a source of pleasure. At the same time, it changes the prisoners, makes them more compatible with the reality outside. So the Glücksanzug, the luck suit, is working in both directions, from inside to outside and from outside into inside. These are constellations that we are familiar with as the circumstances of an interface. in psychological, technological, and aesthetic respects. And the two phases or stages that Wiener distinguishes in the adaptation process between adapters and that to which they must adapt can also be read from this perspective. In the first phase, in the first stage, something like a dramatic difference between mechanics and the flesh of the real is still operative. That would be the situation of the classical machine, because now and again there are, quote Wiener, glitches and unavoidable errors. The individual feels or is aware that he or she is being born sustained by a machine suit. In the second phase, or in the second stage of adaptation, control of the individual's bodily and psychological functions has been perfected. The suit had learned. The cybernetic circuit closed, such that the individual biomodules can enter into a reciprocal learning relationship. This is the phase of the trance classical machine, a concept that Benze introduced into the German-speaking discussion, as I mentioned already, at the end of the 1940s. The individual body projects itself into the world, which in turn clears a space for him in order then to ally with him as an indissoluble hybrid reality, or better, to be superseded in any number of heterogeneous realities. That is the world of tomorrow, in which the individual can feel at ease, can see in endless loops of visuality, can hear the acousmatic, smell the phraseological. Since Foucault, since Lacan, Deleuze, Guattari, Agamben, and other thinkers of the post-histoire and the post-classical subject, we know that the dramatic relationships between those aspects of the real that can be precisely expressed in symbols and formula, and those in the existence of the living, occur not just as a conflict between an interior and an exterior, but the very dividing line cuts straight through the subjects themselves. This is true for both human and machinal actors or agents, and even more so for the hybrid ensembles in which both are entangled and which we might refer to as concrete anthropo-technical systems. Media machines, as well as media people, operate with their binarity in an open, porous framework. This enables them to exchange their constructive and destructive energies, to enter into contact with one another, to communicate with affection, or destroy one another with animosity. Alchemy was not invented in order to grind out concepts, Begriffe. It is more connected with what can be sensuously experienced than with abstraction. As a poetic praxis, in the direct literal sense of the word, as a way of making, it shares the most intimate affinity with the arts of design. The shimmering multiplicity of the meanings of its treatises and fragments is one of its characteristics. Alchemy is a specific form of expenditure, of profligacy. It is the processing of the particular, the individual, albeit one that never loses sight of the horizon of the whole. The texts that it generates are excessive picture puzzles and battles among metaphors. There are still certain alchemical treatises that only very few adepts, masters, and later exegetes were able to read and to understand. In this sense, alchemy is an outright elite theory and practice. It is a dream one is only just able to overhear, that when narrating, one is able only to stammer. When humans cease to be able to dream of their kilns and to eavesdrop on matter itself, then the dream of alchemy retreated back into the night. The highest stage of transformation of a common material into the radiant, beautiful semblance of the coveted noble one was explicitly referred to in some alchemical treatises as projectio. This was the starting point for my interest as a media scholar in this strange field many years ago, when I still was very strongly dealing with cinema and cinema theory and things like that. Projectio. Today, we might call this speculative design. Depending on the specified architecture of the alchemical model, this would typically have been the 7th or 12th stage in the transformation process. In an experiment practical respect, projectio signified a process of throwing design, a process of throwing something in front of you. Precisely calculated quantities of pulverized lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, would be encased with heated wax and thrown on the boiling non-precious metal. In the event that the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, as active agent, did in fact possess the transformative power attributed to it, the sought-after transformation should occur in the last union, which always, of course, will be imaginary. You can see here figure number 40 from a treatise which I found in the National Library in Paris many years ago. And you can see figure 40, the final stage of transformation is named projectio ceratio. Just as the digital today is an infinitely formulated promise that may be held sacred but not kept, the lapis of old was a resplendent, albeit insecure guarantee. The digital is the analogical equivalent of the alchemist formula for gold. This is how I translated a text by Jean-Paul Fargier on one of Namjoon Paik's early videotapes about the Fluxus artist Alan Capro and the poet Allen Ginsberg. The text was published in the 80s. I translated it around 1990. The digital is the analogical equivalent of the alchemical formula for gold. In the act of transformation, everything depends on which substances are used for the work of transformation and which qualities enter into the adopted by the hypermaterial that is supposed to effect the change. Noble matter can only be generated. This is a very important principle in alchemist thinking. Noble matter can only be generated from less valuable matter, though not from wholly base or common material. The material itself has to be kind of noble, which you use for the transformation. Every painter, every artist who is working with a materiological gesture knows what I'm talking about. Roger Bacon, not Francis, in a late medieval treatise, which I found by coincidence many years ago when I was researching John Dee and his early alchemical praxis in the 16th and beginning of the 17th century. Roger Bacon, in a late medieval treatise, specifically emphasized that the material with which the projection was to be done, precisely this lapis philosophorum, itself had to contain ample noble substances. In order to obtain the most beautiful semblance of the moon, silver, or the sun, gold, the philosopher's stone must contain an ample amount of that which it was supposed to yield. I quote from the German translation because it's so weird, just one line from this treatise from Roger Bacon. Darum wir suchen Projektion, zum weißen oder zum roten Werk, so sollen wir es von dem Golde nehmen. Edward Kelly, assistant to the great British mathematician, doctor and cartographer John Dee, recommends in his text on the philosopher's stone that in each case the substance ought to contain an ample amount of valuable mercury, which is valuable also because it binds to the smallest particles of gold. This is, by the way, in a political economy at the moment, especially in Africa and in Brazil, an extremely important point, because the way tiny amounts of gold are digged out at the moment and generated are going very strongly with the help of mercury, which, as we know, is very poison and very dangerous, and people are standing. I saw recently a documentary film on that. It's amazing. They are standing in the water full with mercury with naked legs and trying to find a milligram of gold. It's absolutely weird, because everybody knows the demand for gold on the common market is extremely strong, and so the efforts are so brutal to get even 1 gram of this valuable material. The highest stage of transformation of a common material into the radiant, beautiful semblance of the coveted noble one was explicitly referred to in some alchemical treatises as projectio. Oh, sorry, I jumped. This is due to the energy which is running out a little bit of the machine. I wanted to quote still Edward Kelly. The tincture and the material, the metal tinged, must belong to the same root or genus, and as it is the imperfect metals upon which the philosopher's stone is to be projected, it follows that the powder of the stone must be essentially mercury. Full stop, basta. In the early modern era, alchemical theory and practice served in the self-understanding of a not yet established, highly insecure, veering, once empirical, and soon to be future thoroughly provisional subject that wished to put itself in relation with the other, with that which it did not yet understand, including the other, that was nature, and that which was technology. The cosmos rushed and weird, and to listen to it was felt to be intoxicating. The cosmos projected itself acoustically into the souls of the sorcerers, apprentices, and adepts, and had elected to take part in the world, who were therefore not satisfied with observation alone. As a new model for experiencing and processing the world, alchemy, thus conceived, did not just point back to a magical past, but at the same time, it also pointed toward a possible future. An esoteric kind of education emerged, which we see reflected today in scenes of expanded and also aesthetically applied informatics. And this is my provocative resume of that. It has to do with what you learn and what you make before you actually understand it. A doing, a kind of making before you learned to understand it. In alchemical practice, one can distinguish 3 major fields of activity. We can also locate these same 3 fields nearly unaltered in the design praxis of the start of the 21st century. First, the activity Most familiar to us is the transformation of less valuable metals like copper into the more noble silver and the gleaming semblance of gold, which was symbolically identified with the sun and with the divine. A number of chemical and physical discoveries were made on the occasion of this experimental praxis. Second, in the field of the organic, the magnum opus of the alchemists consisted in generating a substance that would not only make curable any number of illnesses, but that would also make eternally young every living being. In Europe, this substance was called the panacea. In the Chinese tradition, these practices are comparable with that of nurturing life and extending life. The third major field relates to the latter and continues to preoccupy us even today. The generation of artificial, intelligible life is represented in the form of a homunculus, or tiny human being. Today's medical practitioners pragmatically assume that, I quote just one of them, everything nature has wrought can be replicated, and without much complication. Klever, a German medical scholar. The line between stem cell research and blood-based biodesign has become very fine. The earliest known alchemical treatise that arrived to Europe in nearly complete form dates back to the late 3rd or early 4th century, that is not so clear, and was written by the already mentioned Zosimos, whose spiritual sister, Theosebia, Soror Mystica, he refers to her as Soror Mystica, ranks among the most powerful women in the early history of alchemy. Both Theosebia and Zosimos worked in Panapolis, today's Akhmim, once the center of textile production in Upper Egypt. Zosimos early on provided quite clear definitions of some of the principles of alchemical thought and practice. I will outline in a very concentrated and very short form, by way of keywords, 7 of these principles that in my time machine, elucidate the exhilarating play with the deep time perspectives of past and future. I consider these relevant for present as well as future design as principles of thought and practice in the process of transforming the real into a multiplicity of hybrid realities. The first principle of Zosimos is to be understood as a unity of sympathetic connections. By the way, I should mention that because I was very excited with this PhD. This is Richard Asheville, whom you see here up here. I took his PhD on alchemy in 5-6 years ago in Edinburgh, at the University of Edinburgh, because nobody at this university wanted to take this PhD because it was on alchemy, and I said, of course, I'm doing it. He knew my deep time work a little bit and asked me, and it was a great dissertation, a mixture of a wonderful text dissertation and filmic experiments. What we see here is the Ripley scroll from Yale, a 5 meters long roll as an alchemist treatise. The earliest known alchemical treatise and so on, I read that already. The first one, the first principle of Zosimos. The world is to be understood as a unity of sympathetic connections and correlations. Madness of correlation. Spirit and matter are thus to be conceived in their relation with one another rather than as antagonistic dualisms. Res extensa and res cogitans are interdependent and both belong to the very same everyday reality, what we term our world. Updated to reflect a contemporary semantic, we might translate this as technological and biological objects do not comprise ontological oppositions, but gradual differences in the rich variety of relations inherent in any ensemble of inter-objectivity. Second principle, Zosimos, the union of opposites is the ideal of all chemical theory and praxis, as well as its most vital, important content. As the terminus technicus for the union of that which is in fact incompatible established itself in the alchemist's language as the conjunctio. The story of the union of opposites played out in endless variation in the form of the bodily conjunction of young men and women. The hermaphrodite represents the ideal condition exactly intermediate between the sexes, between opposites, still physical, yet bordering on the metaphysical, hyperphysical. Not a third sex, but the abrogation of sexual difference as such. Since the bodily union was already an attractive theme in the visual imaginary, where it was opulently celebrated, it translated easily into the formal language of the instruments in the alchemist laboratory. The double-neck glass flask with its interlocking open-end tubes ranked among the more important vessels in the alchemical workshop. Third, world complexity and madness of correlations. Everything is thought to be correlated and connected with everything else. Each particularity has a counterpart, an analogy better, in every other particularity and in the whole. In early modernity, the ars combinatoria, the combinatorial arts, evolved into much more than a method for knowledge generation. In the Lullian, the tradition of Ramon Lull, of the 16th and 17th century, it was thought of as an intellectual essence to explain the world. The reality of God, the reality of language, and the reality of the terrestrial world were thus conceived as an indissoluble unity. Athanasius Kircher followed Ramon Lull's ideas very closely. This is another artwork on, but I have to jump a little bit. Athanasius Kircher followed Lull's ideas very closely in formulating his ontological model of the ars dei, the divine art. The internal, interior, inner principles of the fabrication and construction of being were generated by means of the recombining God. The subject of the ars combinatoria was for Lull, as well as for Kircher, not the human being, but God. Nearly every page of Kircher's 12-folio Ars Magna Sciendi testifies to the endeavor to comprehend the art of combination in the unity of fabrication and interpretation. These are some pages of the Ars Magna Sciendi, the great book by Athanasius Kircher, written in 1600 or published in 1668 in Amsterdam. This is also present in Mundus Subterraneus, the subterraneous world by Athanasius Kircher, but it's taken from his book Ars Magna Sciendi, the great art of knowing, of knowledge, a very quite unknown book by Athanasius Kircher, very, very difficult to read, full of Lullism, full of this alchemical ideas and experimental practices, and the center thought is this correlation, this Beziehungswahn, this correlation of everything with everything. Kircher's attempt to develop a scientia universalis, as Leibniz put it later, a universal science applicable to all existing things, emerged in a Europe on the cusp of the algorithmization of all possible relations. In the spirit of Pythagoras, number, numerus, became the medium for harmonious composition. The abstract numerical and symbolic correlation among all of being was made concrete through the activity of the combinatorial arts, the ars combinatoria, understood as the processing of the qualitative and the particular. This other disc, I will come back to that a little bit later, comes from Heinrich Conrad, his Amphitheatrum. There are 4 of these discs in this wonderful treatise from the late 16th century. This idea of the madness of correlations is very strongly inside of it. These 4 discs contain the whole theory and praxis of alchemy on 4 pages. This is absolutely amazing and wonderfully to study. Fourth, it's not much longer anymore, don't worry. I have 7 of these points, as I said before, of these items. Both the mystical conception of alchemy and its experimental theory and practice engendered an extremely synthetic language, comprised of a plurality of symbolic elements and allegorical as well as metaphorical motives. This language was accessible only to those who had mastered this particular code, the adepts. Knowing this language meant being granted access to the message's source code, power-coded in a manner similar to the privileged knowledge of today's high-performance computer science. As applied experimental science, as well as an applied philosophy of nature, alchemy worked intensively with formulaic descriptions and translations, transgressing the boundary of a one-dimensional linear language by means of complex formula on the one hand and geometry on the other, is considered alchemy's mediational tactic. This diversity of forms also includes wholly idiosyncratic variants like labyrinthine lines of text and fragmented syntaxes. This page, for example, is referring explicitly to the world of Ramon Lull and his paper machines, the squares, the circles, the triangles, which come a little bit later on the next page, and is dealing with the Lullistic methods of creating thinking machines, thought machines, and transforming that into an alchemist tractatus. And what I refer to with the labyrinthical lines looks like that. We had this discussion last night a little bit, this attempt to break out of the linearity of the one-dimensional code of script was very strongly practiced here. This geometrical form of writing the treatise, of course, always had specific meanings for those who were making this tractati, and they have very, very many layers of meaning. Once I invited Helmut Berghahn from Vienna, one of the rare real old philologists who is able to read the old medieval manuscripts of the alchemists, and after the seminar I made with him and my students in Salzburg, that's many years ago, nearly 30 years ago, he said to us, if you think you have understood anything about alchemy after this seminar, you are completely wrong. We needed another 10 years to work together, and then we could start to read the texts from the 13th and the 14th century and try to understand them together. This was no exaggeration. When you go into the texts, they are highly so strange that it's very difficult for us to understand them, especially when they are written in Latin. Both the mystical conception of alchemy and its experimental theory, this is the fourth item, and practice engendered an extremely synthetic language. This is what I wanted to point out here. And I jumped to the fifth item, heresy, hermetic knowledge, opacity, and secrecy are all tightly bound up with one another in the history of alchemy. Heresy, hermetic knowledge, opacity, and secrecy. One source of livelihood, of subsistence for the alchemists was the highly guarded knowledge concerning the deep truths of alchemical perceptions or insights. They lived off their privileged knowledge of the great work, exercising caution in what they actually divulged of this to the nobles who hosted and financed them. Their failure could entail fatal consequences and was in any event very often linked to violent punishment. Cutting off an ear, for example, which Edward Kelly experienced in Prague, was one of the punishments which was quite usual for those who were somehow disguised as charlatans. Given the depth of their interventions into nature, the Church's various institutions of power regarded the alchemists as Dionysian meddlers with divine authority. Giovanni Battista della Porta from Naples went so far as to recommend means of contraception. This is a tractatus written in secret languages. Della Porta went so far as to recommend means of contraception, among other things, in his Magia Naturalis from 1558. His Academy for Experimental Research into Nature's Secrets, founded in Napoli, was banned by the Vatican shortly after it opened in 1506. Thus, a few years later, Della Porta dedicated an entire book titled De Furtivis Literarum Notis to the diverse praxis of secret writings, scripts, and covert tele-long distance communication. This is the book, one of the rare books by Giovanni Battista della Porta, which stands in my library from 1603. Della Porta thus became a central protagonist in the development of one of the new cultural techniques that emerged in the context of alchemy, essentially from this milieu. Cryptologia, as one of his last, ultimately unpublished books would have been called, was intended as an intellectual and poetic practice to subvert the threats of the censors and inquisitors. As late as 1612, 3 years before his death, Della Porta's patron, Federico Cesi, wrote in a letter that it would be advisable to send him mail via a straw man, since when writing to Porta, letters are not at all secure. What we see here is something very astonishing, which I found 20 years ago or 25 years ago when I worked in the National Library of Napoli. This is a binary code, what you see here. It has two discrete elements, signs, a line and a dot, as you can see here, and then it depends on the combination, ars combinatoria, of these two discrete signs, line and dot, and you can create a whole alphabet. And with this knowledge about how the code works, it's very simple. You can write messages by making this kind of tabula, which you can see here on the left side. We are moving through the 1550s with a binary code. This is even before Francis Bacon and his ideas of binary writing, and of course long before Leibniz and other scholars. Acceleration, this is the sixth item, one before last. Acceleration and punctualization became decisive paradigms in global modernity's program of temporal consciousness. Confessions of increased acceleration have even become, once again, at the start of the 21st century, crypto-philosophical, socially acceptable. I'm not really able to read these texts. The captains don't act so hounded. Wojciech, in Georg Büchner's drama, stands in for the pathologized psyche of the hunted and hounded. those seeking and finding death in decadence. Devil take the hindmost. Alchemical praxis, on the other hand, as an unfolded cultura experimentalis, takes place in the consciously experienced present and is as an activity, at the same time, elaboration. Alchemical praxis celebrates the present and is thus a counter-program to the temporal objectives of the Church Father Augustine of Hippo. Time, according to Augustine, arrives from the future that does not exist into the present that has no duration and moves into the past that has ceased to exist. In strict opposition to this, the magnum opus of alchemy understands itself as a sensual activity in the now. In Heinrich Conrad's famed work, Amphitheatrum Sapientiae Aeternae, Solius Vere Christiano Kabbalisticum, Divino Magicum, composed on the historic cusp of European modernity in 1563, one finds a stunning depiction of the alchemist's activity. The treatise attempts to capture this sprawling complexity in a 4-color copperplate engraving, which I mentioned already. All the correlations that were important to the adepts are represented in the basic form of a circle or a disc. At the first hand, I thought when I saw that the first time, this is a nice image for a DVD or something like that. The fourth panel, with its invocation of humankind, whose whole heart and whole soul are under the sign of divine mercy, Divina Gratia, contains a depiction of the stage and the most important virtues in the quotidian drama of the transmutation. In Conrad's laboratorium and oratorium, the practicing alchemist carries out his most essential activities: praying, working, and making music. The necessary utensils, books and manuscripts, distillation devices, musical instruments are arranged in triangular fashion in the inner circle of the engraving, with a table bearing the musical instruments situated in the center foreground of the image, which is, of course, a sign for the importance of music. Remember my formulation that alchemy has to be stammered, and this also meant you have to listen to it, and the musical treatises from the alchemist tradition are something very special, very meditative music and very interesting. The kiln, and this is what I wanted to put your attention on, the kiln in which sublimations are done on the foreground right, bears the inscription in Latin, Festina Lente. Perhaps you can read it from your place a little bit. Festina Lente, or haste makes waste. The command for silence, patience, and perseverance. Seventh, as it is today in the world of promises surrounding the paradigm and the phantasm of digitality, the alchemical adepts and apprentices treat a very fine line between truth claims and charlatanerie. The great art of transmutation, however, was inscribed with a strict ethical codex. I said before, alchemy is something you do before you really understand it, fully understand it. But this is connected with a strict ethical codex, which the vast majority regarded as binding. Art, science, and virtue were considered identical. In order to work at all, it was an inviolate precondition that an alchemist evince a high moral qualification. Imagine that for the universities now, where all this stuff, bioinformatics and so is done, they would go mad and they would be completely empty. Only steadfast personalities were granted access to libraries, distilleries, and kilns. The transformation of lesser into nobler material always also implied a wish, or at least a willingness, on the part of the transmuter to be transformed himself or herself. In the Chinese tradition, this corresponds, with the internal elixir known as Naidan, which aided in the perfection of one's personality. In the Christian tradition, the same idea is staged by way of a well-known allegory, namely the story of Jacob's ladder. And here I come to the end, which has been formulated 1,000 times over in Western mythology as an imaginary architecture, and highly topical when it comes to medial discourse, thought, thinking. Jacob, on the run from the crime he had committed against his brother Esau and his shameful betrayal of his blind father Isaac, lays his head to the rest on a rock out of fear of his nocturnal fantasies and dreams of winged figures sent by God to earth as his divine messengers, who strive to ascend rung by rung from terrestrial darkness toward the eternal light, and who also descend from the bright sacral glow into the disordered, thus sinful and chaotic real. The description of the transformation process as a form of staircase, as a form of ladder, is nearly a cliché in alchemy, as you know. This is from the famous Michelsbacher Tractatus from 1616 on Kabbalah, the opus magnum in 7 steps, in 7 stairs. And what we see here is Jacob's ladder in oil and gold on canvas, a Byzantine painting from the 14th century, which also has a sound inside. Bit louder. Stepped or tired architectures have become an intensely dramatic field. Here, organic and built realities encounter one another. Ladders and stairs are experienced in the most literal sense of the word, like prosthesis. Ascent and decadence are the 2 principal movements that can be practiced here, subdivided again and again and again in the exact sequence of advance and rallant of the legs, in the negotiation, overcoming of differentials of hate. In Deleuzian terms, one might speak here using the word pair, difference, and repetition. For Jean Dubuffet, materiology, this is my kind of a conclusion. For Jean Dubuffet, materiology was no less than the study of the relationship between heaven and earth, a beautiful formulation. Materiology was no less than the study of the relationship between heaven and earth. In the late 1950s, the French artist developed a series of pictorial objects tending in 3 dimensions, in which he allowed natural materials to collide with and act upon one another. That amounted to experimental interobjectivity more than half a century before the concept of interobjectivity got a foothold in the art philosophical marketplace of theory. Expanded materiologies is what I am terming a concept in which the boundary between res extensa and res cogitans, between the macrocosm and the nanoworlds, is continuously, radically transgressed, and everyday reality gradually translates into that tension-filled ensemble of the bio and technological, of which we are an integral part. Under capitalism defined in planetary terms, we can no longer afford comfortable viewpoints. This includes the realization that the reciprocal relationship between hardware and software, or more recently between the fluid, the wet, the bloody, and the intelligent things, wetware, this is the name for this field, is not a new wonder of the world to which we must now pay homage. Rather, it is anchored in a long tradition of thinking of what is called life. Crucial for the alchemists' thinking is something which seems to be rediscovered again strongly at the moment. The material, the world of the material, is not passive, it's active. Material is active. This means it can do more than just hitting back. It does not only suffer us, it is an agent. We live in interobjectivity. This is also a potential space. Thank you very much for listening so long.